Let's keep the conversations going. And speaking of, we have a great guest that's up for the next half hour. I'm excited to introduce Alex Rosalez. So Alex is a technology executive with more than 25 years of experience, 22 which were honed at Amazon. He has 17 years of experience building and leading teams of engineers, project managers, product managers, and data scientists to deliver results for customers. Alex is currently the director of product inclusion at Snap. I just had to. And was an engineer and product leader at Amazon for 22 years. So without further ado, Alex, welcome to Conversations for the Future. We are really excited to have your presentation right now. And of course, everyone listening, don't forget to go in the chat. We'll leave some time for questions toward the end.
Awesome. Thank you, Meredith. I just want to make sure people can hear me. I'm assuming you can.
Good. And I love Dr. Spock off in the corner.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he keeps me honest. That's what I've got him there for. Yeah, thank you for the great introduction. You saved me from having to do that myself. So yeah, I actually, one thing that is interesting though, is that I recently sort of pivoted my career, having spent 22 years at Amazon, focused on, various aspects of Amazon, e-commerce, search, Alexa, AI, that sort of thing. I recently pivoted to focus on social media at Snap, as well as this concept of product inclusion, which I'll just expand on briefly before I move into the presentation. The concept of product inclusion is relatively new in the tech industry. And the idea is, how do we build for everyone, with everyone? In the tech world, we tend to build for averages, or for sort of a bell curve, the average user customer experience, because we're building at large scale. It's impossible to build, one-offs for everyone. So we tend to build something that is a one size fits all. This has only gotten us so far. And what we're learning is that there's a big opportunity to serve the outsides of that bell curve, or the edges. And so what that means is that we need to start thinking about who are the people that are using our product, but we may not be listening to, we may not be hearing what their challenges are, and how do we build to serve those populations. And so I'm super excited to be working in this space because it presents so many unique challenges. And also working in social media as well, I think is just the kind of future of how we communicate is through these sorts of networks. So yeah, so today I want to talk about what we can learn from social media, social messaging to enable communication in space. And so before I go into that, I just want to talk about some of the key challenges that will come from space communication that might benefit from innovations in the social media space. So when it comes to communication, bandwidth and data rate is one of the biggest factors. It can mean the difference between grainy black and white video or a high definition 4K color video. The good news is that bandwidth in space is getting better every day. NASA is developing ways to communicate with infrared lasers, which is also known as optical communications, which will result in higher data rates. So as an example, Artemis 2 will have an optical terminal that's capable of sending 4K ultra video from lunar orbit. And for reference, 4K is about 4 times the resolution of the average social media video. So that's quite a bit. We get by quite well at that. Another concern is latency. So communication is bound by the universal speed limit, the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. When spacecraft are close to Earth, that delay is pretty negligible. But when we get further out, it could take anywhere from 4 to 24 minutes to reach its destination, and then another 4 to 24 minutes to receive a response. That's because at its closest, Mars is 35 million miles away, and the furthest distance planets are 250 million miles away. So that's definitely going to be a factor, latency. Interference is another factor. The further communications have to travel, the more interference they have to deal with. That's interference such as the atmosphere, the sun, other missions that are transmitting data, etc. And this can cause deterioration or scrambling of messages or videos and that sort of thing. And when you combine that with latency, it's very difficult to correct for that interference, because if you find that you've got a garbled message, now it takes additional time to transmit that information back to get a resend, right? Privacy is just as important in space as it is on Earth, as communications being broadcast through space can easily be picked up by bad actors along the way. And, as individuals, I think we all understand, the importance of privacy. When it's not there, we run the risk of personal harm. And similarly, organizations such as governments and corporations also need privacy to protect their ideas and or the safety of their customers, their constituents, their employees. Collaboration is also important in space, as we're learning and trying new things and trying to figure everything out. So we need content aggregation and messaging systems that allow different people that are working on different projects to be able to collaborate effectively together, given these constraints in terms of like latency and speed. And then finally, multimedia is super important, right? So the kinds of information that we'll want to transmit will vary from basic text type of messages, textual information, to rich media that contains video, sound, and possibly even like three-dimensional data. Could you imagine how cool it would be to capture three-dimensional data, Mars, and then transmit it back so it could be explored and analyzed in a sort of VR 3D environment? So, bandwidth is plentiful, but latency and interference are concerns. How can we use the technologies that we've developed so far to create social media networks to address these challenges and enable communication in space to be functional? So before we dive in, I think it's important to talk a little bit about social media and how various social networks are differentiated based on the type of content that people primarily engage with. So from Wikipedia, definition of social media are interactive media technologies that facilitate the creation and sharing of information, ideas, interests, and other forms of expression through virtual communities and networks, right? So some social networks are content forward, right? Like Facebook or Instagram. By content forward, I mean, when you open the application, the first thing you see is a feed of content, and the experience is optimized to get you to scroll and consume content and engage with it and keep you there. Other, apps like this are more messaging or content creation forward. So I think Snapchat is a very classic example of this. When you open Snapchat, the first thing you see is a camera, and the idea is that you are creating a message, you're sending it visually to other people, and you're primarily using the app to communicate and connect, right? And in addition, Snapchat's messages are ephemeral, which encourage this sort of authentic connection, which I will talk about more a little bit. So, given that latency is a concern and communications are lagging, and by the way, so that's just sort of a high level of what social networks are. Now I want to talk about like how do we leverage what we built the social networks to address the challenges I had outlined before. And latency is one of those challenges, and communications can lag as long as 24 minutes. Real-time communication is going to be far less convenient, right? So, with that big lag, you can't make a call, you can't make a video call. 4-minute, 24-minute lag is not going to work, right? So this is a place where the aggregation aspect of social and the asynchronous communication aspects of social media platforms can be an advantage, right? So for example, a feed aggregates communications created by users in the network over a period of time, right? So those communications in social media, we know of them as posts or content, right? And the algorithms that power those feeds make sure that the user is seeing the most relevant content to them at any given time. And so because you have this latency that's happening, you're not going to be able to just scroll endlessly, right? So when you're scrolling endlessly today in a social media application, when you hit the bottom of what's in your feed, it has to go back to the network and load that next piece up. And so it's constantly hitting the network and transmitting data back and forth. With this latency, that just wouldn't be acceptable, right? So there would be a need to preload that content into the user's system well in advance, which means that the algorithms need to be even more accurate in terms of figuring out what that user might want or need to be viewing at any given point in time. So, imagine, if the feed was containing information that was useful for a specialist to be able to do their job, right? So the whole concept of enterprise social networks is an emerging concept where you're leveraging a thing like a social network or a feed to be able to capture content that is useful in an enterprise setting or sort of a work or collaborative setting, right? And so imagine if that feed did contain that information. Let's say it was the latest research that's relevant to their work, or updates on key projects, or results from a distributed computing cluster, or analysis from other specialists elsewhere in space or on Earth. Instead of having to optimize for what social networks optimize for today, which is keeping you stuck to the experience, right? They would need to be optimized maybe for productivity or sort of the usefulness of the information, right? So, we could leverage a lot of these models. We have to think about how to optimize what content we send. We have to think very carefully before we transmit content and think about what's the most relevant pieces. So I would say that in space communication, with that big latency, relevance and having algorithms that are able to predict what's needed become even more critical than they are today. So another aspect that creates challenges here was latency. Real-time communications becomes challenging. So imagine, being on a call with somebody, having to wait 8 to 24 minutes or 8 to 48 minutes for them to respond to your first question, right? 4 minutes for them to receive your question, another 4 minutes to receive the response. So, how would one-to-one communication be facilitated in that sort of environment? So, typically real-time communication is ephemeral, right? That's another aspect that's interesting, right? So when you make a phone call or a Zoom call like we're having today, the communication, the conversation isn't recorded by default, right? And so that's something we take for granted oftentimes, that this ephemeralness allows us to communicate authentically without fear of the conversation being used against us in some way, or the way that we look. I didn't really spend a lot of time getting ready this morning because, I know this isn't going to be blasted out to everybody, right? So I think, that gives us that benefit to be authentic and be able to have the conversations we need to have in order to be effective in how we collaborate and how we connect with one another, right? And so, synchronous video also allows us to collaborate while seeing reactions to thoughts, to ideas, to our work product, right? I think we communicate so much through the visual form. And so having that real-time feedback is so useful. But in a world where asynchronous communication, is the norm because of the latency, how do we try to maintain some of these benefits, right? So, one of the things I talked about was the ephemeral nature of real-time communication and a social network. And again, I work at Snapchat, so I'm a little biased in this direction, but Snapchat's messages are by default, messages of video are by default ephemeral. So when you open Snapchat, the first thing you see is a camera that you can use to capture a photo or a video. Then you can also apply filters, which we also known as lenses. They add special effects to your photo or video, which allow you to add more expression and information to the content that you produce. And when someone receives your message, they can choose to respond with text or video. But because of that inability to have face-to-face collaboration, I think in space, maybe there'll be more video communication to kind of increase that bandwidth of information. And sort of applications like Snapchat make it easy for that to occur. And because they're ephemeral messages, they disappear after a short period of time unless they're saved by one of the participants, which can also help with privacy concerns, in addition to making sure that that communication is sort of authentic and direct. And I think when it comes to collaboration, authenticity is so important, right? Being able to understand where people are coming from, how they feel about something, right? Facts are important, data is important, but at the end of the day, as humans, we have to make judgment calls and decisions. And oftentimes those need to be informed by, how we feel about the incompleteness of the data we have. We have to make those judgment calls. We have to have debates, and those debates can become heated. And so being able to have that extra ability to have that bandwidth of communication and that authenticity of it, I think will go a long way. So how do we handle the interference that comes from space communication? interference is going to be a huge challenge, especially given that, that we have latency, right? Which means that if data arrives garbled, it's going to take additional time for corrections. So we're going to need advanced error correction capabilities. Work is being done today, to use AI to correct images and videos that contain artifacts. So, for example, it's being used to improve the quality of image and video content in social media. So as an example, maybe a picture was taken in low light and has noise from lack of signal because it's low light, or perhaps the image or audio was transmitted over a low bandwidth connection. Maybe it's in a rural area or developing country with lower quality internet connection. And so it's heavily compressed. AI is being used to sort of replace that noise and replace compression artifacts with corrections. So maybe that technology can continue to be extended and expanded and become even more useful in space, where we don't have time to go back and ask for corrections. We need to do those in real time without that assist. And then, finally, today's social networks are centralized. Could decentralized social networks have a place in space communications? So, today's social networks are owned by various entities. For example, Facebook and Instagram are owned by Meta, Snapchat's owned by Snap. This means that content created on and posted on these networks is actually, technically under that control of that entity. And so some people, might have concerns with that, right? They might want to control their content, especially if you're trying to decouple yourselves from the existing systems and sort of ownership models that are, we're bound by here on Earth. Could you benefit from leveraging a decentralized social network to create a whole new network that, is independent and not coupled so tightly there? And so there's a new type of social networking emerging that I learned about as I joined Snap is called DeSo. And what DeSo stands for is distributed social. And it's the first and only blockchain that is built from the ground up to power and scale a new category of decentralized social applications to 1 billion users. So, it aims to allow content creators to control their content versus the social networking companies. And in addition to distributing ownership of that content so that it's no longer centralized, it also supports end-to-end encrypted on-chain messaging, right? So that also addresses the privacy concern. So that's an emerging technology that could also be, useful here and worth exploring. So with that, I want to close with a few questions to think about. What are other challenges that people might have communicating in space that are unique to space? How else might the technology that social media has brought us help us to address those challenges? And what new technologies might we need that we haven't even considered? I want to use my remaining time to open it up for discussion. I want to see if you have any questions, if you have other ideas or answers to the questions I just posed, challenges with space communication you want to talk about, or ideas on social media oriented solutions. Love to have that conversation.
This is all great. And it's so important. I mean, as much as we don't want to say, or admit it, I think social media, everybody's on it, whether it's Instagram, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Snapchat. I mean, especially these younger generations, this is the way to reach them. But I think something that we run into a lot is false information. I mean, I'm in the news business. I'll admit it. It's a struggle a lot of times with facts getting out there and then misinformation. Are there ways that as members of the space community, we can be the most responsible for our posts, and how can we motivate and encourage these future generations using the power of social media to make a difference, but also make sure it's more factual versus something that people are just using for, as you say, clickbait?
Yeah, I love that question so much. I think that, I was talking here about how we can leverage social media in space. And I think what we're talking about here now is like, how do we leverage social media to further the cause of getting humanity into space, right? And I think that is an important conversation to have. And one of the things that we've been learning, even though like we control the social media platforms, Snap, I'm part of Snap, I control, me and my team, we control Snap, right? And Facebook was that, and Facebook and Instagram, etc. What we're learning is that the most engaging content that we can present to our users is not like, what are what's content being created by the person with the highest followers. Like the person with the highest followers in the world is Cristiano Ronaldo. He's a soccer player, right? But like if he posts something, it's not going to, if he were to go post about space, it's not going to help solve your problem, right? The way you need to do that is to create highly engaging content, right? So it's not like social networks are no longer about, you know, how many connections you have, how many followers you have, etc. It's about, can you create extremely engaging content that can go viral? And so what I would do is I would think about like, how can I take the message that I have and turn it into something that is going to resonate with my audience, right? So in our case, Gen Z. And one thing I've been learning is that Gen Z, you know, 13 to 24-year-olds ish, they are far more unique. I feel like, you know, boomers to Gen X to millennials felt like an incremental step in terms of the differences between the generations. When you think about it in contrast to Gen Z and millennials, it's a huge step change in terms of, you know, how they think about the world, what matters to them. And so I think it takes very careful you know, analysis. You need to spend time talking to that group, you know, before you can even send them a message and tell them, hey, here's why space is important. You need to sit down with them and learn about what they care about, like what matters to them, right? And some of the things you're going to find out is that they really care about people. They care about connection. They care about social justice. You know, they care about you know, the environment. You know, even more so than previous generations. It used to be that people would become, you know, a certain generation would become more conservative politically at a very linear rate over time. This generation is not. It's going pretty flat, right? So that's another example of how different they are, right? And I'm not trying to make a value judgment of whether that's good or bad, right? I'm just trying to say that's the generation. And so how do you understand them and how do you reach them? You need to go and talk to them and listen to them to be able to craft the right message. Does that answer
Exactly.
your
How many
question?
people remember cassette tapes? And that's how we listened to music back in the day, you know, and then we went into CD players. And even some of the kids now are like, what is a CD player? I mean, it's amazing to see, but we still have to reach generations, whether it's the newest or the oldest. A great question coming in from Anara. From your perspective, coming from Amazon and Snap, is there a focus on a human feature in space when it comes to product roadmaps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, I think right now, and a lot of publicly traded companies, as you know, we're always worried about, you know, the next quarter, right, or the year-over-year results. And, you know, while we have this vision, you know, like at Snap, we have a vision of furthering human progress by enabling connection. You know, it's so easy for us to lose sight of the big picture in the long term. And so, you know, the answer is, I don't think there is that focus, and I think there needs to be, you know, and I think that's a problem. But what oftentimes happens is that, you know, we're trying to just survive that next quarter. Like the current macroeconomic environment, you know, advertisers are pulling back, right? And so, you know, you end up being in a situation, you know, Facebook's the situation too, where it's like, how do we continue to make the money we need so we can exist and serve our customers in the face of this environment? And what we really should also be doing is thinking about in the long term, you know, how do we, you know, enable human progress, leveraging space? And so I think that's a missing component. And like, how do we get there? How do we make that a focus is going to be challenging given, you know, the current, even in a really good macroeconomic environment, it's challenging because it's hard to say like, okay, if we do, you know, invest in space, what's that ROI going to be, right? And so I think that might be where working together with this community, like trying to find places where the ROI can be, you know, so it's a win-win, right? So that we can, you know, generate the revenue we need so that we can serve our customers better, while also finding ways to further along the mission of you know, space and human future in space.
Right. I mean, you just look at everyone always wants to know what's in it for me. How's this going to impact me? And I think the more we get this conversation going, the more we're communicating, the more people realize that this is going to impact every single person's life on this planet and then planets to come. And going to start with all of us making that a reality and making those facts the truths that we're speaking. A great question coming in from Titan. Any insight into using quantum entanglement for comms? I like that question.
No, actually, that is not an area that I have any knowledge in, but I would love to hear if you have thoughts on it. I'm curious.
Titan, you can talk.
All right. Well, if anybody does, feel free to raise your hand. That is a really good question. I'm going to take that one and look into it.
Yeah, no, part of that is just I have a interest in everything science and Star Trek and so forth. Star Trek's big into quantum entanglement and so forth and that stuff. But I know that there's work being done with that subject matter. It's not sci-fi anymore. People are looking into it. And if you talk about the equivalent of Starfleet's ability to talk on subspace, quantum entanglement seems to have our best chance for it. And I mean, just in the process, if you look at the process of how we develop new technology, you can only imagine what great stuff will come from just being able to develop quantum communication, zero time zero time communication, opposed to light speed communications.
Yeah, basically zero latency, right? It would solve the latency problem, right? There'd just be no latency. And all of the things.
Put Starlink out of business.
It would actually benefit on Earth and outside of it everywhere, right? I think it also would change the way computers work, because even computers are bound by latency, even within a computing platform, right? And so, like, I think it would be such a game changer that I couldn't even imagine what it would what the world would look like, right? I think I remember reading a little bit, because I'm a huge Trekkie as well. And so I remember reading a little bit about this. And my understanding is that we're still a long ways away from being able to harness it and apply it. But I think if it could be applied, because of the zero latency, you just basically removed half of the challenges that I, articulated, right? And so I think that, like, suddenly, you wouldn't have all these limitations in terms of real-time communication in space, et cetera. And I think that would be important. So I think, to your point, maybe it's worth us, investing more resource into making that, applied, right? Because as we go to space, it becomes more important. I think it's not as urgent right now on Earth, because we have fiber optics and all of these things that enable rapid, low latency communication. So, like, we're fine, right? And that's how we operate. We don't want to over-invest in something if it's not going to provide immediate benefit. But when we get to space, it becomes very important. So that's a good call out.
Yeah, the moon won't be so bad either. It's only about 5-second worst case scenario, and you can live with that. But definitely when Mars becomes settled and we're talking about regular communications. I mean, I've seen people talking about theoretical GPS and building their own internet on Mars. They're also, actually, I just saw an article. There's several organizations working right now to work on the GPS for the moon, even before getting built before Artemis 3. I think that was one of the things they want to try to have that in place before Artemis 3. So just extending our conveniences out into the universe is going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, actually, don't underestimate the sort of impatience customers have. So, like, or just people have. So, like, moon, 5 seconds of latency. So I say something and then 5, 4, 3, like, that's a long time, right? You can't have a real-time communication there, right? And so as more and more people are in that distance, they're going to be demanding real time. That's what they're used to, right? And so I think that that's that sort of push that you need to get people to say, hey, if I can solve this problem, I'm going to capture everyone on the moon that's there, right? So I think that's the kind of when it comes to industry, like, we're prioritizing, or say tech, like, we're prioritizing these sorts of things based on, consumer demand. So you got to first create a problem, right? And then once the problem's there, then we're going to look at solving it, right? And so we're not typically solving problems that are 20 years out, right? Because, that's risky. How can you predict if that's going to be a real problem?
Awesome.
One little historical note: latency is not a new issue. Back during the Apollos 15, 16, and 17, they had the robotic camera on the lunar rover. And on the when the astronauts were going to lift off from the moon and return to Earth, they would park the rover a certain distance away so they could document the launch. Well, for the first 2 launches, the camera operator back in Houston didn't realize about the latency. So he was always 5 seconds behind. So the story I heard when I was at NASA was that these guys rehearsed, and then Apollo 17, they got it perfect. So latency is not a new issue. It's just something we're getting around to.
Yeah, and like Kevin points out that, we have it for presentations. Of course, it's fine if it's a presentation, but like when you're trying to do something that requires real time, that's when it becomes an issue. But yeah, great, all great call outs.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for hopping back in. Titan and Alex, thank you so much. That presentation was wonderful. I mean, just giving us more to think about. And that's the great thing about these conversations. It's a conversation. It doesn't end here. So we're going to take what we learned today, reach out, make these connections, start new conversations, and eventually we're all going to be 10 years from now, probably looking back and just being very glad that we started them today. So thank you so much, Alex.